Okay, thank you, Kenza. So without further ado, I am delighted to welcome Kenza to the stage. I'm going to pin you, Kenza, and see if I can do this. Okay, Kenza, welcome.
Fantastic, thank you. I will try to kick you off the screen share so I can get these slides up here. Hopefully you can all see these now. Brilliant, seeing some nods. Great, thank you so much, Donna, for that introduction, and it's great to be here with you all today. My name's Kenza Esalama. I'm a senior associate at Purpose Union. I'll share a little bit more about what I do at Purpose Union while I speak, but I want to dive in. So when I was preparing for this session, I was reflecting quite a lot on this word intergenerational that sort of frames the webinar today. And I often worry that words like these do get overused and become buzzwords that sort of lose their meaning. And it got me thinking of the true meaning of this word intergenerational. It doesn't start and end in the boardroom. It's actually a cultural norm. And in the UK, I don't know about you, but I've always thought that we don't really have a very intergenerational culture. You know, we move out from our family homes at 18, off to uni far away or starting apprenticeships. We spend our 20s and 30s in cities like London, living in flat shares with strangers that we never speak to and battling the commute, heads down on the tube or the bus, and so on and so forth. And that's always really bothered me. I had always, when I was younger, had these visions of moving to an apartment block in London and forming bonds with my neighbours, just like they do in Friends, doors left open, everyone milling around in each other's kitchens, sharing meals and stories, highs and lows. But in reality, the majority of my time at university in London was actually spent in lockdown during the COVID pandemic. We were all sent home a term into first year, suddenly plunged into distance learning from our childhood bedrooms. And it was rough. But in my final year, I was lucky enough to move back to London with my best friend. We moved into that apartment block, ready to take on the world. And yet for almost 2 years, we did not cross paths with a single neighbour. Now, one day on my way down the stairs, I bumped into one of these elusive neighbours, a woman in her 50s who'd lived on her own in the block for 6 years and knew absolutely everything about everyone. She was bubbly with this infectious energy, and I just couldn't contain my excitement that I was making friends with my neighbour finally. It didn't matter that she was 30 years older than me, we just hit it off. And soon she'd introduced me and my flatmate to other women in the block as well as in the neighbourhood. And we now have this women's group that spans every decade from 20s to 60s. And we host these regular gatherings that are so incredibly full of intergenerational wisdom. And we're just constantly telling each other just how amazing it is that we all can learn so much from each other, regardless of our age and experiences. So all that to say, I am a huge advocate for intergenerational dialogues. And yet I just don't see them enough, especially in the workplace. Now, I think a lot of that might come down to misunderstanding each other. And if that's the case, you are in luck, because today I'm going to be sharing with you the latest Purpose Pulse data from Purpose Union, which explores Gen Z and millennial expectations, concerns, and views. Now, if you don't know us, Purpose Union are the social purpose strategy firm helping businesses and nonprofits to find, communicate, and ultimately achieve their social purpose. So whether that is framing climate justice to Gen Z across Europe or campaigning for FIFA to recognise the Afghan women's football team, we work by developing compelling arguments, building powerful coalitions, and devising winning campaigns really to change the world for good. Now, the Purpose Pulse is a crucial part of our work, helping organisations to navigate the rapidly changing sort of landscape of millennial and Gen Z concerns and expectations. So, what were the top line findings from our research? As I say, we looked at a range of social issues, polling Gen Z and millennials in the UK and the US. So broadly, social issues matter a lot to these generations. They increasingly expect businesses to do more on these issues, and they believe that DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, is simply the right thing to do. Now, when it comes to the specific issues they care about, the cost of living is far and away the top priority for these generations, with 84% citing this as the dominant challenge. This is closely followed by mental health, home ownership, economic inequality, and climate change. So a key insight to take from this really is that the cost of living is an essential lens and frame through which to talk about social issues for these generations. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but who are Gen Z and millennials really? They're certainly not homogenous groups, and their opinions do vary. So to paint a bit more of a nuanced picture, we've drawn out 5 core personas, which you can now see on your screen. I won't go into them in too much detail today, but please do get in touch if you would like some more information on these. I think they're really interesting. So in these generations, we're seeing a growing number of optimistic change makers, but at the same time also a rise in skepticism. And this is very much driven by economic uncertainty and frustration with the status quo and inauthentic corporate actions. So as you can see, on one end of the spectrum here, we have our optimistic activists. Now they account for 30% of Gen Z and millennials, so they're the biggest grouping that we have here. They're driven by hope and passion. They believe that businesses really can play a key role in solving social issues. And for them, climate change is their top priority. We then have this middle group here of potential supporters who care deeply about social issues, and they do want companies to take a position, but they're a little bit more skeptical and they expect far more than just lip service. They're prone to signing petitions or protesting companies that don't align with their values. And finally, on the other end of the spectrum here, we have our purpose skeptics, who only account for 14% of Gen Z and millennials, but are still very important to consider. This group has actually increased in size by 8% since 2021, and they're largely very cynical about businesses, believing that their social purpose efforts are inauthentic and largely misplaced. They still do care about issues like climate change, but this very much takes a backseat to their personal economic challenges like home ownership and job security. So the question now then is, who do these groups really trust to solve today's most pressing social and environmental challenges? We're going to spend a bit more time speaking about this shortly, but one thing is clear. Businesses are in the line of fire. 53% of Gen Z and millennials expect companies to do a lot more on social issues. And that's actually a 14% increase on our polling in 2021. So we now have this state of play of business unusual. It's just not going to cut it anymore for businesses to stay silent on social issues. Now, I opened this presentation reflecting on how intergenerational dialogues are so rare in the workplace and beyond. Perhaps the starting point to unpick this then is to look at the stereotypes of Gen Z that may be blocking these conversations between generations. And as a Gen Z woman myself, I was particularly interested in what non-Gen Zs think of us. So in very Gen Z fashion, I asked ChatGPT. So I've got to admit, this was a bit of a hard read, and I did take some offense to these allegations. Although, well, the first one is potentially true. But cynical, lazy, and entitled, I'm not going to let slide today. So instead, I'm going to take you on a bit of a myth-busting, data-backed journey to come to a better understanding of the Gen Z psyche and help you to engage with us more meaningfully. And in all fairness to ChatGPT, it did apologise, as you can see, and said that labelling an entire generation as lazy is an unfair and inaccurate generalisation. So I won't hold a grudge. So let's start with myth number 1. Gen Z are lazy and entitled. Now, perhaps this is just the eternal perception curse of being the youngest generation, but one thing about Gen Z is that they are actually incredibly activist. On the screen now, you can see a comparison between Gen Z and millennials on their participation in different forms of direct action over the past 12 months. Interestingly, donation, arguably one of the more passive forms of activism, is the only form of direct action where Gen Z and millennials are fairly equal. But when it comes to protests, boycotts, signing petitions, and volunteering, Gen Z are significantly more active. In fact, they're actually 10% more likely than millennials to have boycotted a company in the past 12 months. You only have to look at the case of, say, Starbucks, for example, in relation to Israel-Palestine and the recent news that their CEO commutes to work by private jet to see just how prevalent this really is. Earlier this year, Starbucks reported a 15% drop in net income, and this is closely related to the global boycott driven by primarily Gen Z audiences through social media. So it's clear that Gen Z really aren't afraid to take a stand on the issues that matter most to them, and beyond this, be vocal about that online. But you'll be glad to know that Gen Z don't just take action when they aren't impressed by a business. They also reward purposeful initiatives that tackle the issues that are most important to them. As you can see here, businesses who do this benefit from Gen Zs mentioning them positively to their networks and being loyal to their products. And 59% would even recommend them as a place to work. So where does this lazy and entitled myth come from then? Our data provides a really interesting insight here. 60% of Gen Z do not believe that they can personally have a measurable impact on the environment. So what does this really mean? It's not that they aren't interested in tackling climate change. Instead, they've wised up to greenwashing and flimsy asks for individuals to turn their lights off and recycle. They know that the real power lies with governments and businesses to bring about systemic change. And what I'm going to speak about next will show you this in more detail. So we now know that Gen Z are a passionate and activist generation. So let's move to this next myth. Are Gen Z cynical? As I've just touched on, they are all too aware that individual action is just not enough to shift the dial when it comes to issues like climate change. But that doesn't mean that they aren't hopeful for the future. Now, with the range of issues facing Gen Z, you might expect they feel pessimistic, angry, or resigned. But actually, the overall picture is much more positive. This is a generation of both hope and concern, as many are worried as they are hopeful. But the low scores for cynical and resigned do show these generations are also very much engaged and they're not just giving up on their future. And while hopeful was the most common word used by Gen Z to describe their view of the future, they're actually also 10% more likely to feel excited about the future than millennials. So where should this hope and this excitement be channeled? As we've established, Gen Z don't believe that they can individually make a difference when it comes to solving today's big challenges. However, both Gen Z and millennials are big believers in the power of individuals coming together to tackle the issues facing us today. In fact, they trust collective action almost twice as much as they do governments and businesses. Now, this means that both governments and businesses do need to provide meaningful spaces for young people to collaborate, engage, and shape the future. So this has been a very much whistle-stop tour of Purposenian's latest Purpose Pulse data on what really matters to Gen Z and millennials. I kicked off this presentation by telling you about my intergenerational neighbourhood group, and I also shared this latest data with you, which I hope has inspired you to give you some of the tools to start opening up conversations with generations different from your own, whether that's on the tube or in the workplace. This benefits us all, both personally and professionally, in endless ways. So that brings my session to a close. I'm shortly going to hand you back to Donna, but before I do that, my contact details are on the screen as well as a couple of QR codes. The first will take you to the Purposenian website to find out a little bit more about what we do, and the second will take you to the download link for our full Purpose Pulse report. So do have a read, and thank you so much again for your time. I will hand back to Donna.
Wow, Kenza, thank you so much. I'm in awe. I mean, I'm in awe of the QR code. The technical knowledge of young people is I'm learning all the time, and I love the myth busting stories that you've told and data to support them. Going from that wonderful conversation and recognizing we're all in this together. We just need to talk and create better together. Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I'd really encourage you to read Purpose Pulse. It's an unbelievable insight and helps us much better understand the differences and the opportunities for collaboration and strengths through collaboration. Before I pass on to Karen, has anybody got any burning questions that they have for Kenza right now? Just looking for any hands up or in the chat. Let's have a quick look. Lots of applause, Kenza, which is a very good thing. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be more questions as we go on.
Thank you.
If I will now return to the slides, which hopefully you can now see. And I would love to introduce you to Karen Larby. Karen.
Thank you so much.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Let me just pinpoint you or spotlight you. There you go. Cool. I will put your slides on now. Just bear with. There we go.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. It's really great to see all of you. I actually I'm going to put this on gallery view so I can see as many people's faces as possible. I like to speak to an audience. So my name's Karen Larby. I'm a DEI strategist. I'm also a social change trainer. I have a lot of experience in working with and training activists and campaigners, and people who are change makers and really trying to make the world a more fair and just place. My background is in the charity sector, and I also most recently worked at Purpose Union as well, with Kenza, so it's really great to work with Kenza again. And I'm really interested in the intersection between racial equity and environmentalism. And because of that, I set up an organisation called POC in Nature, which is all about encouraging people of colour and creating spaces where people of colour can have conversations about access to nature. So it's such a privilege to be here today. Thank you so much, Donna, for sparking up and instigating this really valuable conversation. I love the word intergenerational, and Kenza's story was so poignant for me because I come from a very communal culture from West Africa in Ghana, where intergenerational is a very intergenerational culture. But however, moving to the UK, well, my parents moved to the UK in the 80s. And so that kind of intergenerational culture has kind of fizzled out. And so it is a real loss for me personally and for a lot of people from my background. So it's really great that here we're starting to we're tapping into conversations about how to have these intergenerational dialogues, because I really feel like that's what's going to save the world. So in my work as a DEI consultant and a social change trainer, I've designed and delivered DEI training, I've designed and delivered campaigning training, I've convened advisory groups for clients, and I've partnered with organisations across different sectors, from the Wellcome Trust to the RSPB, to the Campaign to Protect Rural England. I'm also part of initiatives like Climate Reframe and Decolonising Economics. And I've seen businesses and charities and also grassroots groups grapple with questions like, how do we genuinely live up to our values? How do we centre justice and equity in our work? And how do we make sure that we're breaking through generational and systemic barriers to do this effectively? And one thing I've learned is that transformation doesn't happen in silence, and it doesn't happen in silos either. It happens when we convene and create brave spaces for these tough, honest conversations that are often avoided. And if we're really serious about tackling issues like climate justice and DEI, we really need to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems that we're part of and the power dynamics at play and the ways in which different generations approach change. So I've often seen organizations set really ambitious goals around diversity or sustainability, but when it comes to implementation, they balk and falter. Statements of purpose are released, reports are published, initiatives are announced, but the follow through is where the real work begins, and that's where a lot of companies fall short. And at the same time, generational tensions can exacerbate that challenge, especially as we, go back to Kenza's conversation with ChatGPT about the stereotypes about Gen Z. I've worked with younger teams, particularly when I designed and delivered a campaigning training program called Rooted in Resistance, which was a campaigning training program for climate activists of colour. Younger generations really demand accountability, transparency, and action. And I've also worked with leadership teams who have decades of experience in navigating systemic complexity, but they really struggle to adapt to new ways of thinking and new ways of being. Bridging these divides is not easy, but it's absolutely essential. And so I'm really seeing organizations that are showing what is possible. So for example, I work in the climate space a lot, and the environmental sector is the second least racially diverse sector in the UK. second only to farming. And organizations like the RSPB are really recognizing that they need to do intentional work around integrating DEI in their environmental mission, even in the face of backlash from their members, because they recognize that conservation efforts must also address systemic inequalities when it comes to access to nature. Another example I would use is the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. They have a Sustainable Futures report, which is another example of how we can combine social justice with environmental justice and reimagine how we redistribute wealth and resource progressive economic and climate action. And so, you know, I'm really seeing groups and organizations that are challenging us to confront colonial legacies and also look at the intersection between colonialism and the climate crisis. And organizations are looking at this head on, and they're doing more than just talking, they're creating pathways for action. So it's really important for organizations and business leaders to spark intergenerational conversations in 5 ways. First, by acknowledging the intersections, like I mentioned, recognizing that DEI and climate justice are inseparable. Second, by creating brave spaces for dialogue. These conversations can be really uncomfortable, but I'm seeing organizations set up and resource community groups, advisory groups, youth panels, and lived experience advisory groups where people can really share their views on the products and services that companies offer. Be honest about power dynamics is the third thing I would say to leaders. You know, generational tensions often stem from differences in power and privilege and perspective. So senior leaders can often feel defensive while challenged, and whereas younger generations feel frustrated by slow progress. So it's really important to explicitly acknowledge and name these dynamics. The fourth thing I would say is learn from lived experience. Climate Reframe, for example, is a really great initiative that seeks to amplify the voices that are underrepresented in the climate space. So definitely check them out. And fifth is act and stay accountable. Accountability is key. Conversations are the start and not the finish line. So set clear, measurable goals around DEI and climate justice, and be transparent about your progress and also missteps and mistakes, because that is really valuable and really builds trust. So what I'll end on is this, you know, companies really need to be thinking about, and business leaders really need to be thinking about their legacy. So questions like, what kind of legacy will your leadership leave is really important. And also, what is the risk to your business of not doing anything? What is the cost to your brand of continuing to do surface level interventions? And what is the risk to your brand to continuing to exclude the most marginalized? So it's really important for us to all commit to the hard and necessary work to have these courageous conversations. Let's really center the voices that need to be heard, and let's create businesses that truly embody the values that we aspire to. So I'll hand back to Donna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. I've been scribbling away, but transformation doesn't happen in silence or silos. And I think there is a sense to me of people leaders who are, I think the average age of a CEO is something like 54.9, I looked at the other day, and non-exec directors 60.5, are pretending this isn't happening, even though it's in all the marketing collateral. And there's a couple of things lots of things that you mentioned there, but around being comfortable with being uncomfortable as a starting point for that conversation. And really importantly, where are those diverse lenses of lived experience? Because without that, you're going to have a very narrow view of how to develop your business as a force for good and build a legacy that is fit for future generations. It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. Does anybody have any burning questions for Karen before we hand over to Dewey? I can see a yes from Solomon. And thank you, already responded. Joseph Roundtree report is in the chat for those of you who are interested. Lots of resources that our speakers are signposting you to, and hopefully you're making a note of those. Thank you, Karen. Without further ado, I am going to now hand over to our next speaker, Dewey. Dewey, would you like to introduce yourself, and then I'll put your slides on?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so good morning, everyone. I mean, I think it's a tough act to follow for sure. But thanks, Donna, for creating the space and to actually have this important conversation. So professionally, I'm a senior analyst at Ralph Lauren, but on the side of that, I'm also a climate advocate and a youth voice champion. So I mentor students in schools and also speak at schools so young people can understand the importance of their voice. I've also spoken at a few conferences about encouraging more young people to take ownership of their careers, and also have spoken to businesses as well about how they can integrate young people into their workforce and be better corporate activists. So by working with different organizations and charities and being on youth boards as well, I hope to offer some useful insights today. So yeah. But yeah, I can start off with first of all, which is the benefits of embracing intergenerational differences. So I think it's important to recognize that if you are going to have these intergenerational discussions, that both sides have something to learn from it, and that's why they are both, and that's why these conversations are really useful. Don, I was just wondering if you could put on the slide with the strategy, just so if everyone wants to see. Can continue anyway, whilst it goes on in the background. But yeah, so some of the benefits I think for having young people in the room for sure is that because young people are so much more resilient and they're used to sort of surviving and adapting and reacting to global issues, it means that they can actually help businesses to be resilient. And young people being more innovative and being more creative, they're not constrained by that life experience, and I guess have that naivety in a way that is sort of the magic that can help with more inspiring ideas, can help businesses to actually be more innovative and also stay current because young people actually understand these emerging trends. Obviously, having senior leaders in these conversations as well, they understand the market dynamics, they can offer their wisdom and experiences to help with a more long-term perspective, more effective strategies for risk mitigation, for example. I know already that P&G, Unilever and PwC already have reverse mentoring programs in place within their companies. So it is something that is starting to gain traction. And ProTV also found in one of their most recent reports that actually having young people in boardroom meetings or in meetings in general can actually help them to be more productive and hold leaders to more account and encourage more ambitious commitments, especially those around ESG. So hopefully it's kind of clear from the benefits that there is a lot of benefits to be had with these intergenerational discussions. So the next thing that I wanted to debut, which you can see on the screen now, is my youth strategy that I've sort of come up with. And that is so businesses can actually become more attractive and integrate more young people inclusively into their workforce so that these intergenerational discussions can take place. So I'm going to be sharing a couple of insights from my own experience, as well as kind of how I have conceptualized the strategy. So the youth strategy is just youth, and it goes with youth advisory board, opportunity to learning and growth, unified networks and partnerships, targeted funding initiatives, and holistic culture. So I'll take you through kind of each stage of the strategy that I've come up with. So first of all, youth advisory boards. I think having a youth advisory board in place within your company can help young people to feel more valued, and give them a space where they can share their ideas, have their voice be heard, and also connect with other young people within the company so they can build up a youth network. But one thing that I've learned from my experience is that these youth advisory boards should not be separate from boardroom discussions. So you still need to have like that youth perspective in boardroom meetings. So having maybe like a youth representative, so someone from the youth advisory board, also sit in at these boardroom meetings, can just make sure that that youth perspective was always there. I think it's also important as well for senior leaders to have the right mindset to foster that sort of culture of psychological safety, so young people do actually feel comfortable in sharing their ideas and voicing their thoughts. In the advisory board that I'm on with the Engineering Development Trust, this is something that I am quite fortunate to have. So it just means that any contributions and ideas that I do make, I feel comfortable to share them. And, you know, they're also willing to listen to them as well. And lastly, to ensure that our advisory board is as effective as it can be, I think it's important to also have follow-up discussions to make sure that you actually do hold businesses to account and that they actually are, I guess, utilising the youth advisory board is not completely pointless, and it's just to ensure sort of true inclusivity. So for example, making sure that actions from the youth advisory board are being taken forward, for example, by having it released in like a newsletter or in a report, which ideas have been actioned from the youth advisory board, can just make sure that, you know, not only do young people feel heard, but they feel like they are really sort of contributing towards impact within the business. So that brings me on to the next stage of the strategy, which is opportunities for learning and growth. So there was a stat that I found in a people management article for this year, which is that almost 50% of young people would leave employers if there aren't enough opportunities for learning and development. So it's definitely useful to have these opportunities. I'm sure they do exist in a lot of businesses, but I think having young people and new hires actually be made aware of these progression opportunities and having defined career pathways can be quite useful to make sure that young people are actually aware of how they can accelerate and move forward in their career. Having mentoring programs, like I mentioned at PwC and Unilever, for example, as well as feedback mechanisms, can be quite good. And having like a two-way conversation. So, for example, young people can share what they'd want to learn, how they want to grow in their career, but they can also receive feedback from senior leaders on how, you know, what they should do to actually improve their work and how they can actually progress onto the next stage. I think what can be quite useful in these kind of, sorry, I do apologize for my voice because I'm recovering from a cold. But I think what can be quite useful to think about when you are doing these mentorings and having these feedback sessions is what you would have liked to know at that age. I think it's often easy to forget as you sort of become more established in your career what you didn't know, say 10, 20 years ago. So I know, for example, non-linear career path is something that is quite a hot topic for young people at the moment, and they're trying to sort of understand and realize that, you know, you don't have to, it's not necessarily what you study that will determine what you do in 10 years' time. There is a lot of fluidity within your career. So having maybe training programs as well for senior leaders to ensure that they're actually enabled to foster this culture of psychological safety, as I mentioned, and have these conversations with young people and have the right mindset to do so, I think can be quite useful. Alongside that, having training obviously for young people as well to grow both professionally and personally can be quite good. So in certain jobs, there can be technical tools to learn, which again, that's the professional development. But I think having training for soft skills as well. So for example, public speaking, that can also be quite good for a young person, because not only is that a skill they can use just within their remit of their job, but they can take that outside of their job as well and use that to accelerate and grow their career in general. And I think it's something that young people would actually be after and be looking for, is how they can actually grow holistically. I know at Ralph Lauren that they had a careers day there where we had the opportunity to actually step outside of our silos and actually understand what other jobs are available to us in the business. So we had the opportunity to actually hear about what other departments across the firm are doing, and we actually had the people who work in our stores enter our corporate offices and understand what our departments do, so they can actually see for themselves and hear from the people how they've grown their careers and their journeys, so they can also do the same. So I think having something like that can actually be quite good, because it means everyone can kind of come together and learn about different career journeys and career pathways within a company.
Brilliant. Dewey, can I just stop you there, please?
Yeah.
We're running out of time. That word silo keeps coming up, doesn't it? And I really, really enjoyed that. And I think an insight into how many leaders, experienced leaders, older leaders, still have the same frame of reference. And the world has changed, is changing at an unprecedented rate. And we need to listen to people like you. I love the idea of, it doesn't matter what size the business is, of encouraging people to try different roles and facilitating that. I love culture of safety, because unless young people and a diverse range of lenses are encouraged safely to have those conversations, nothing changes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. The reason I jumped in was conscious of time for discussing this. So you've been given a whole bunch of inspirational conversations by David, inspirational presentations, and what we'd like to do now is to go into breakout rooms for 20 minutes or so, and we've got some rules of engagement. Now, this is something encouraged by, this is yet another one of my learnings from the group of speakers. I'll just let you read that briefly. I love this, and I think it should be in every boardroom, actually. I think it's really important, each and every one, but step up and step back. If you're somebody like me who likes to chat, just be mindful of those who don't generally come forward. So it's finding that balance. Please avoid making any assumptions. Be confidential and be authentic, and listen to understand rather than listening to respond. So I've got a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. These are the two questions, and we're going to go into breakout rooms, as I said, with 3 or 4 people in each. What value can intergenerational discussion bring to business, senior leaders and young people? And hopefully you'll build on some of the insight that you've heard this morning. And secondly, what's stopping you? What barriers can you perceive? And I guess the sub question is, so what can we do about that? So what's the point? What value can intergenerational conversations bring? What barriers are there, and what can we do about them? So 20 minutes or so, and then if you wouldn't mind nominating someone within your group to feed back. I'm just going to do a little bit of jiggling around, as a couple of people have had to leave. We don't want anybody in a room by themselves, do we? That looks good to me. Okay, I look forward to seeing you in about 20 minutes or so. Just bear with me. I'll just move Rachel. Rachel, I'm just moving you. It won't be at all uncomfortable because I don't want you to be on your own. Cool. I will see you in a minute.
first one's back.
Can you see the questions?
Yes, it's still in kind of full slide format, but that's fine, I think.
Is that still in presenter mode, Kenza?
It is. I mean, I don't think it's a huge issue, but
No, it's just super annoying, isn't it?
odd.
We did so well at the beginning, but okay, fine. Okay. If everybody is back. Welcome back, everybody. How was that? All good? We've got a few minutes. I would really love to hear what happened in your room, what you learned, and actually how you answered these questions. So I did hope that you'd nominate somebody from your group, and I am going to ask for somebody to go first. Otherwise, you know what happens.
I'll jump in.
Rachel Dagger. Thank you, Rachel.
Oh, sorry. I think it's Catherine who's going to go then.
Okay,
yes,
I'll come to you next, Catherine.
I was
okay.
in a group with Neo and Jack. We had a really interesting conversation around point one. We really talked about how important it's going to be for that continued learning. So each generation is going to bring a different viewpoint on what they've got and a different experience and different level of learning and understanding, and it's what we keep versus what we throw away. So what does the older generations need to kind of establish, right? What have we learned? What's the experience that we can pass on to the next generations, and vice versa, the next generation saying, these are our challenges, these are our opportunities, help us explore and learn those. We talked about how, I think it was Kenza's point about the myth around entitlement, and how actually Gen Z are entitled, and being entitled is not a negative thing from the perspective of our group. It's a positive thing. You're entitled to have a voice. You're entitled to communicate and to push for change to happen. And I think twisting on that word of entitlement, I think, could be a really interesting added value point that could bring to those intergenerational discussions. And then the barriers, the big one that we came up with was kind of how the selection of committees are happening. The fact that a lot of emphasis is placed on experience rather than perspective. And we think the shift should go to perspective, because whilst you might not have 40 years under your belt and a lifetime of career experience, you've got a whole different outlook on the world compared to different generations that you may encounter within the workplace. So that was our kind of perspective on the two subjects.
Love that, and I know that there were some crossovers, and I love that from experienced perspective, Rachel. Thank you. Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. So with Julie and Rachel, and on the value point, we've probably got half a dozen bullets, but one of the values is we get a broader range of experience, so we get that diversity perspective and leads to better outcomes. Sort of, it's more realistic than aspirational, I suppose. We talked about improving organizations' brand, the perception of the brand, the reputation of the brand. It links back to things like fostering a culture of safety. We also talked about attraction of talent and retention of talent in terms of linking that into the reputation of organizations, because people vote with their feet, and certainly the younger generations vote with their feet because they're very much value bound in terms of what they will and what they won't do. Building on that, on the piece that Rachel was saying, I think there's something around seize the ambition to protect the future. There's lots of energy and enthusiasm from our younger generations. It should be seized because we need to prepare and protect the future. It's more authentic, so it builds trust and then links back into that safety culture. And I suppose coming on to barriers, then there are culture clashes. One of the biggest things, there's just different cultures that are coming together. So there's not understanding on either side. But I think it's where the power lies, and the power lies within the older generation, and stereotypically the older generation hold the power. So that's a challenge in terms of one of the barriers. So we see it as systemic. We also think that there's something around fear, personal fear, to actually challenge the status quo, either in terms of the impact it would have if you're at the lower end of a hierarchy, or you don't have the power within the organisation to say anything, so what's the consequence? But also the fear of losing power if you're in a senior role. So if I open up this box, this Pandora's box conversation, does that mean then I can't lead because I don't do my command and control? I then have to do it through more diplomacy or collaboration. And then we finished it on sort of ignorance of different generations. So if you're ignorant with a lowercase I, not a capital I, so it's not a problem in your world, it's a blind spot, then you don't open up the conversation. That's a barrier. So you can go to board and say, I want to talk about, and somebody would go, it's not a problem as far as I can see, let's move on and let's talk about business as usual. So I think that surmises. I hope I've done as justice my group. Thank you. So yeah, thank you very much.
That sounds brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. Seize the ambition, I think, is such sound advice. Boy, are we going to need that in this rapidly changing world, both societally and from a climate perspective. Fantastic. Who goes next, please? Who hasn't had a chance to speak?
I can go next.
Thank you, Karen.
I was in the room with Solomon, Tomar, and Holly, and we had a very wide-ranging conversation about how intergenerational discussion really enables companies to improve their products and services. It really brings a different experience to the mix, and it also helps young people understand how the world works, what processes are in place in order to create change, and really how the world functions. We talked about the importance of digital communities and how there's this stereotype that virtual working or remote working prevents promotions because young people aren't able to access senior leaders and have conversations with them at the water cooler. But actually reframing it by saying that having a remote workforce actually makes it easier to book virtual coffees with people in leadership positions, especially if you're in a multinational company and your senior leaders are in a completely other country. Be able to use technology to be able to meet and network is really vital. And the point was raised about technology and how it can bring more accessibility to disabled people, and how we need to be creating spaces, digital spaces that are full of care and intentionality and joy, and doing so in a really valuable way. And in terms of barriers, we talked about how even though most boardrooms are made up of older people, there is a lot of ageism in the workforce where certain older people are excluded from the workplace because of perception that they lack skills and certain expertise in that, and are outgrowing the workforce. So the importance of upskilling and supporting older people to participate in lifelong learning so that they can remain in the workforce and provide their intergenerational or wisdom to the younger generation. And yeah, the importance of remembering love in these conversations. Love is not a word that, I often say love is not a word that we use in the workforce or in the workplace a lot, but it's something that is important to uplift and be present to that. We do this, especially those of us doing social change work, we're doing it out of love for ourselves, for our communities, and for the earth. And so really centering love is really important in inspiring those intergenerational conversations.
I love that. Thank you. And how joyous to be on a webinar when we are discussing the importance of love. And actually, I think we all need to love each other more to face what, you know, the future that we're facing. I think, Kenza, we are the last group to go, unless I've missed anyone, and I will double check before we do. Kenza.
Yeah, thank you so much, and really interesting insights from everyone. I had an excellent discussion with Donna and Alexina, and we were all obviously very broadly aligned on the huge value that these discussions will bring to businesses. And we focused a bit more on sort of the barriers to kind of implementing that more culturally within the workplace. And I think a couple of barriers that came up for us first was transparency. So the fact that age is really often a taboo in the workplace, and I was sharing my own experience of feeling like I had to perhaps conceal my age from kind of people that I worked with, so they wouldn't kind of perceive me as being, you know, less competent or less experienced. And I've always been someone who sort of punches above my weight in terms of the roles that I apply for, but I also felt, you know, that imposter syndrome where you do end up often being sort of the youngest person in your sort of workplace and wanting to make sure that you're not perceived that way and in any negative way. And I loved what Rachel said there on that note about kind of shifting our expectations in terms of recruitment as well, from kind of experience to perspective, and the value of that sort of diversity of thought that is brought to workplaces through that. I spent quite a lot of time talking about recruitment as well, and just the fact that while I think internally workplaces have largely become more progressive in terms of their policies and the opportunities for L&D that they provide, actually recruitment itself has really lagged behind that kind of journey and that growth. And I think that, you know, we still see a lot of job descriptions asking for, you know, X number of years of experience. And we were just talking about gendered norms as well, in terms of tendency to apply for a job. You know, women are likely only going to apply for a job if they meet every single kind of criteria listed on a job description. Men are more likely to apply even if they only meet one or two of those as well. And I think that extends to kind of age as well there. So there's a lot that can be done, I think, in terms of that initial job description that comes out, you know, not asking for a number of years of experience, explicitly encouraging applications from people who don't necessarily meet the kind of all of the criteria listed, and trying to find ways to make sure that extends, because of course you can't go away from the fact that your CV and your LinkedIn will also kind of reveal your number of years of experience as well. So how do we kind of challenge that too?
Brilliant. Thank you, Kenza. And last but definitely not least, Holly.
Thank you. Yeah, so Kenza, so I'm a recruiter. I've been recruiting in technology since 2015. So diversity and inclusion, I think, is something you know, every recruiter should embed in their work. You know, I wouldn't call myself a diversity and inclusion specialist, but it's a big part of my role, my everyday role, and completely agree with you on not having unnecessary requirements in job descriptions, because people that aren't feeling entitled won't apply to them, and that often includes women or younger people, etc. So I'm always trying to learn and see new perspectives within my work. You mentioned about perspective. I think was it yourself that said about perspective over experience. And my approach to recruitment has historically been, yes, I'm not going to put a silly amount of expectations up, and I want a diverse range of people to apply. However, and I'm not looking at years of experience, but I am looking at relevance of experience. And I wouldn't necessarily go for the most senior person that applies, of course, but I am looking for the relevance of someone's experience. And just for like an example here, and sorry if this is taking a long time to ask, but like I've recruited someone for a data science position before that's come straight out of Manchester Uni, because they had a module within their course on recommender systems, and that was a big project that was upcoming in the role. And so he had no actual experience in commercial experience, but we hired him for the role and he was fantastic, and he went on to work there for many years. But let's say you've got someone who has a great perspective, but you also have someone who's a bit more experienced and the experience is relevant. Like, what's your view on that? Like, I'm obviously a recruiter, but like from the perspective you just mentioned, like what are your thoughts on that? Where does that sort of like yeah, I don't know if I'm asking the question very well, but do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you so much for your question, and great to hear that you've been kind of embedding those practices in your own recruitment. I think it's a tough question. We spoke about this in our kind of breakout room, but I think the issue is that, you know, one recruiter or one employer kind of taking these more inclusive practices and taking a chance on someone who doesn't necessarily have that kind of requisite experience is one thing, but actually it needs to be much more of a kind of a culture of change across the kind of entire ecosystem, because if, you know, another employer or another sector isn't keeping up with that progress, it does mean that you might get kind of siloed within just one particular job or kind of one sector itself. So I think it's difficult because the owners can't just be on sort of one individual like yourself kind of taking that chance on someone who's just graduated. It needs to kind of be something that feeds through the entire industry as well. So I think it needs to be kind of a systemic sector-wide sort of shift, which is difficult to do overnight, but I think conversations like these are really important, sharing those experiences, you know, you amplifying that kind of perspective. You took a chance on somebody who just graduated because, you know, you'd seen something in them and now they're actually really successful and they've kind of grown in that business, is an amazing case study to share around. So I think that's something that's really important to do.
Thank you. And I would say that I think the industry is improving and things are on the up, but like you say, conversations like this still need to happen.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you so much. Thank you for responding to that really useful and important question, Kenza. Very quickly, and if you do need to go, I fully appreciate that we're 5 minutes over, but I can see Jack's got a hand raised. Jack, would you like to ask your question and then we'll close?
I'll try to be very brief because I know we're over time, but I was just most recently the workforce planning person for University of Manchester. So I really just wanted to come back and add to that your question, Holly. I think there's always a workforce requirement. The organisation's got a job that it needs doing. And so I think the aspect of relevant experience is very important. But what you've got to take out of the selection process is anything that would eliminate someone because of their diverse background and their perspective. And actually, I think that what organisations do very badly, especially large organisations, is that they only recruit for the needs of the current job, the current workforce requirement in that role, instead of taking the long-term perspective and saying, how long do we actually want that person with us? And if it's 5, 10, 20 years, then what are we likely to need for our organisation over the next 5, 10, 20 years in terms of diverse perspective? And that means that you choose differently. So I'll just leave that as that. And I think that's the change that's actually required. I think people are too short-term in their view. They just recruit for the current requirement.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, Jack, that the biggest challenge of our time is short-term thinking in a long-term world. And whether it's politicians, whether it's business leaders, the way that we live and work and play is changing at pace and scale. And as business leaders and as employees and future leaders, we have to adapt much, much faster than we're doing. Some of it's systemic, but actually, you know, whether it's transformation that will come with not in silence or silos, I will use that again, and seize the ambition and remember love underpinning all of that. What an amazing group you have been today, and thank you so much for engaging, for contributing to this important conversation. We will continue to challenge leaders to be more courageous, and we will continue to bring these uncomfortable conversations to the table. Kenza and I were saying we'll plan a bit of a catch up on this. So what did you do differently? You learn all of this stuff. What did you do differently? What did you find difficult? How can we help each other be the change that the world so desperately needs? Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're a little bit late. Please keep in touch. UK for Good has got all sorts of stuff going on, and we'd love you to be part of our community if you're not already. But enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Solomon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Dewey, Karen, and Kenza. You've been amazing. Really appreciate it. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.